Hey everybody, Tony D and Little Joan here with a screenwriter's take on Spider-Man No Way Home. We're going to get into a non-spoiler review. Normally I do a non-spoiler review and a spoiler review in the same video. I'm going to do two separate ones because this is kind of an important movie in the current era of movies we are in. So it's very complicated, my views on this subject. We're going to get into it. Smash like and subscribe. Thank you for smash liking and subscribing. Please check out my books. The links are in the description. Comedy Horror in South Jersey. It's the Pineys, books 1 through 7. Now, as some of you who are new to the channel may or may not know, I'm a screenwriter and I analyze things as a screenwriter and moviegoer and all that good stuff. So, Spider-Man No Way Home. Non-spoiler review. First up, good movie. Was entertaining. Good performances. It was a little luxurious, I'll say, a little fatty, I would say, in that it's a little long. It's a little long. It could have tightened up a little bit. I think there was a lot at the beginning that probably could have just disappeared. But I think the initial premise of the movie, how it all starts, the event that starts the action that leads to such danger, really was kind of silly when you get right down to it. But in terms of comic book sort of plots, I was okay with it. And the reason I was okay with it is this movie, unlike a lot of current movies, provides excellent what I'll call fan service. If you're unfamiliar with the term fan service, what that means is it's stuff that happens in the movie. They're basically payoffs with the characters and things that audiences want to see. Now, there are things in fan service there. It's very easily to go too much fan service, and that was a real problem with movies, I think, in the 80s. It was too much fan service, too much pandering. Okay, yeah, we wanted to see that, but that fan service can paint you into a corner from a story perspective. You could end up doing things that the audience may think they want to see, but ultimately it harms the narrative and the film as a whole. This movie, in a different era, in the 80s and 90s, you would probably peg it as, yeah, that was a little too much. But in this era where we haven't gotten the satisfying sort of payoffs and things and the characters doing what we like to see. I mean, we live in an era where James Bond doesn't do half the stuff James Bond is supposed to do, right? Whereas in Spider-Man, this movie couldn't be more Spider-Man, right? It's maximum Spider-Man. I think if they end up making sequels with Tom Holland, this movie will still be the most Spider-Man movie you've ever seen. That all being said, even though I like the movie, I do think the that aspect of the movie is a detriment to anybody who hasn't seen like every Spider-Man movie in modern history, starting at the Tobey Maguire all the way to the current Spider-Man. Because the entire movie hinges on what happened in the previous Spider-Man movie. It's the only way it starts. And I don't think that was the strongest way to start this movie because Spider-Man has always been based mostly in science. And so they add this element, and I don't think I'm giving anything away to anyone who saw the trailer. They add this element with Doctor Strange. And Doctor Strange is a supernatural guy. In the comics, yeah, they interacted, but not frequently. And the thing about Doctor Strange is, and magic in general, magic is, if you don't define the limits of that, it can quickly get out of control in your narrative. You gotta have some limits, or you got to start asking the hard questions from a story perspective. Well, if you could do X, why can't you just fix everything? If you could do X, Y, and Z, why can't you do A, B, and C and just make this problem disappear? And that kind of element, if you stop to think about the events that lead up to what eventually happens, yeah, I mean that's an issue, which I'll get into in the spoiler review. That all being said, this is a narrative that the protagonist really proves himself a true hero. And that's what has also been missing from a lot of recent films. You don't have characters that are real heroes. You don't have characters who are sacrificing to achieve a true heroic ending. You have a lot of characters who are compromised, who do things that heroes really shouldn't do, or you have a lot of woke stuff, which is sometimes that and sometimes just lecturing nonsense that nobody wanted to hear. So this movie is completely woke free. I mean, you could argue maybe the initial casting early on was a little bit diverse and woke, but not really. I mean, that really hasn't impacted the movie. I think the cast is solid. Maybe in that first movie there was a little tinge of that, but they didn't seem to make that an issue in this movie at all. So none of the usual nonsense from Hollywood. This is pure popcorn. It's just one satisfying scene after another, and there's a lot of emotion here. A lot of it's not really a lot of fun. It's a lot of drama. It's a lot of comic book drama, and some in between stuff is fun and interesting and kind of the stuff you want to see. Again, it gets a little much, but you want to see it. You're okay with it because you want to hear those responses from the characters. You want to see the interaction. You don't this is an opportunity where a lot of characters come together that you haven't seen together before, and the audience wants to be satisfied that at least the basics were covered. You know, if you had Superman and the Incredible Hulk meet and they never threw a punch, you'd be like, what a ripoff. Right? I mean, you want to see who's stronger. You want to see who can win in that fight. If you don't have that fight, then what's the point of the meeting in the first place? So the fan service is excellent. The plot, when you stop to think about it, doesn't really totally hold together. There's some issues there that I think I'll get into in the other one, but overall the fan service is so good, you don't care. You don't really care because it's so entertaining. It's so nice to see the actors and the characters do something good and mostly positive. I'll say it's a very positive movie. You really feel that Peter Parker is worthy of being called a hero. He's really a working class guy, and this was always why I think Spider-Man was popular. He was an everyman who became a superhero and didn't let it go to his head at all. You know, that first lesson Peter Parker has in the comics sticks with him through the rest of history for the character, essentially. He doesn't become one of these highfalutin Avengers or, you know, members of the Fantastic Four. He joins them, but it's never a good fit for him because he always goes back to what he feels he should do, and that is to be your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, to be the guy who protects the little guy. That all being said, it's a little disconcerting in one scene where the crowd turns against him, which I thought was a little bit odd. I thought they kind of needed to get into that a little more, why some of the locals kind of turned against Spider-Man. I think that would not happen. In the universe they set up, even not just the comics, I don't think the locals would turn against Spider-Man at all, ever. He's too local. They like him too much. They don't believe the negative press about him ever. You know, there's a handful of people that do, obviously, and that's really sort of the villain for Tom Holland in this movie. It's not any of the standard villains, I'll say. It's Jay Jonah, you know, and there's there's some metaphor with the with, I'll say, the online media. The right wing media kind of puts them in that category, but they don't beat you over the head with it. It's very subtle and light, so you don't feel like they're picking on that or anything, that or saying that he's necessarily. I mean, Jay Jonah was always kind of that guy anyway. So it works with the characters. It doesn't feel super political or anything. Nothing like that. It doesn't tie into any real world politics. Not, again, not woke at all. And there's a reason why this movie is doing gangbusters and why I even bother to go see it. I don't bother to see a lot of movies, as you all know, and I get requests all the time. Well, why aren't you reviewing this movie or that movie? I just don't want to waste my money on a movie that, you know, after I see the trailer, it looks like crap, or, you know, I know too much about how the sausage is made, so it's very easy for me to look at things and go, oh, this isn't adding up. For this movie, you know, everything added up in a good way. Everyone who saw it told me it was great. Not good, but great. Is it great? I have to say it's kind of hard to say. I kind of doubt, you know, if you look at this movie, it sort of depends on the future. Like if they make more Tom Holland Spider-Mans and they continue down the path they've been on, which is a good one, plus you got the lead into a movie that's inevitable, then I think you'll look back on this movie fondly. I think it'll be a fond memory, but I don't think you'll call it the best one, because really to understand it, you need a little too much Marvel lore to really get every reference. And even I didn't see some of the movies, so I made sure I read the synopsis of the movies I missed just to get the basic facts in my head. But they do a good job laying it all out, so it's not like you're really missing out. But to really appreciate it fully, you need that background on the Marvel lore. Now, was always a problem with the comics. See, the comics got late in the run, right? Like, I was reading comics in the 80s and 90s, and this was very late in the runs of popular characters like Spider-Man, the X-Men, Batman, Superman. So by that time, they had accumulated so much ridiculous baggage. I mean, there were just characters all over the place that you had never heard of that once in a while would be mentioned. You'd be like, what? But back in the day, they would make references to specific issues that you could go back and buy and read and look at, or, you know, get the reprints. That all sort of disintegrated starting in the 2000s. By that time, they kind of just abandoned all that because it just was, I think, too much work for the current crop of editors at Marvel and DC. They just didn't want to do it. And quite frankly, they probably weren't paid enough to do it. Things changed in the world of publishing, but that's a separate video. And that's part of the reason comics aren't as fun and exciting as they used to be. It's partly because, you know, these stories, the stories that the movies tend to be based on, are the really good ones, which tended to take place early or at the peak of these superheroes. You know, the best Spider-Man comic book story has always been considered the Gwen Stacy saga, and with the Green Goblin, always been considered top-notch, the best, hands down. And the reason for that, I think, is because unlike most comic book stories, that gave you closure. That gave you an ending. It was spectacular, even though it was maybe not the happiest ending. It was a spectacular ending to a long-running story, and really they never hit that mark again with Spider-Man, ever. They came close a couple of times, but ultimately they would end up undoing it because, and they even undid that one, really. They undid it because comic book companies, you know, it's not about the new, it's about how can we repackage the old, in my view. The corporate comics are kind of that way. Now, there's very little new, in my opinion, coming into these universes. And the problem is, and I've always said this to fans, comic book universes like Marvel and DC are like a fishbowl where you put action figures in. and for a while it's cool, and you see the action figures, they're interacting, but eventually it fills up, and then it starts to spill over, and then what do? Well, if some of the characters die, well, then the fishbowl empties a little bit, and then you got more room. But no one in comics ever dies, so that's a real problem. In the MCU, we're still in that era. We're still in the era, yeah, now we got a lot of characters to deal with in this movie, but ultimately, the universe can only be so big because this franchise can only last so long. So even if Tom Holland signs on for another three movies, which I think he will, I think they'll get him they'll back the money truck to his house. I mean, they have to. They have to. It's too much money. It's just too much money. They'll do anything to get him back. And he will be handsomely paid. I predict Tom Holland will probably be the highest paid actor in Hollywood history for the next contract he has. Because this movie is grossing so much money. It's such a monster hit. It has such great buzz. This is going to it's steamrolling The Matrix 4. Thankfully. Thank you, Spider-Man. Thank you for saving movies. It's doing so well. It absolutely crushed opening weekend and previews. It crushed all the previous, we'll say, pandemic records. I think it's the third biggest opening. Third biggest. And you can see why. I mean, Spider-Man is the best character in the Marvel U, in my opinion. And Tom Holland, in my opinion, is the best Spider-Man. Not to knock the other two guys. They're great. I really do like Tobey Maguire. I think the first two movies are awesome. I think there were problems with the third movies. I didn't see the Andrew Garfield movies. I won't get into that, but I did like him in this, though. I did like Andrew Garfield, and I understood what he was doing in his whole shtick. It makes me want to go back and see those two movies now, in fact. And I may, in one of the streaming services or whatever. But this is worth your time. The only thing I'll say is there are two end credit scenes, and one of them, it's not much of an end credit scene. I'll say the second one's not. It's really not. I don't want to tell you what it is, but it's basically a trailer for another movie. So I was a little annoyed by that. I wanted to see something a little more, I wanted to see a little more data. There were rumors early on that we were going to see a character from the Marvel Universe that we have yet to see, which would have explained some of the behavior, which I'll get into in the more detailed analysis in the next video. But that didn't come to pass. So this was pretty standard. It was light. It was complicated, but it wasn't too complicated. They still were dealing from fallout from the blip, the 5-year gap where people disappeared with Thanos, which, see, this is part of the problem. This is why I wouldn't have done the blip. Because in movies, in comics, yeah, you got to do that. People in comics used to love that stuff. They love that continuity and all those little details. It's great. In a movie, you don't have that kind of time. You don't have that kind of, pressure. And even the lead-in from the previous Spider-Man movie, it was a cliffhanger, if you haven't seen it. And I don't think a cliffhanger works with the movie unless the movie's going to come out like almost right away. They did it with Back to the Future. They did it between 2 and 3. I forget the gap between those two movies. It sort of worked, but didn't. It wasn't really a cliffhanger. This cliffhanger, I don't think it really got them much. I really don't. Other than the ending to the previous Spider-Man movie, Far From Home. Is it Far From Home? Yeah, Far From Home. You got a bit of a shocker at the end, like Spider-Man going, basically. But I don't think it really gained them much. It left them with a kind of a mess to clean up in this movie, which they do. They clean it pretty good. But, overall, I would say the movie's a little long, but totally enjoyable. I'm nitpicking. I'm really nitpicking here. I think this is, out of all the movies that have come out this year, if you don't see this, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. You're obviously not a Spider-Man fan. Now, if you're not a fan of superheroes and Spider-Man, yeah, you probably wouldn't see this movie. I mean, but even if you're not, I think you would enjoy it. I think it's fun. If you haven't seen any of these movies, yeah, it's probably not for you. But I think it's a solid flick from top to bottom. Um, I just think the mechanics of it don't really work, but you won't care. You won't care. If you really start thinking about it like I do, you might ruin it for yourself a little bit. But I'll get into the screenwriting of that in the next one because that's more nuts and bolts. I think it could have been dealt with in a slightly better way than it was, but you can't argue with success. You can't argue with the great performances, and the performances were really spot on for a lot of it. Some of it just felt like, oh yeah, there's that guy too, but it was for the most part. I mean, Alfred Molina was great in it. He really was top notch, and he's a good actor. I mean, a lot of these guys are really good actors, and there's a reason they picked the ones they picked. You had all the best guys. This was really the highlight of Spider-Man from like the last 20 years, not quite 20 years or so. So Spider-Man No Way Home, totally recommend. Really not a lot of drawbacks in this movie at all. I think you'll enjoy it. I think you'll enjoy it. I think the crowd enjoyed it. Um, but if you want the breakdown of the screenplay and the issues I see in that, join me for the next video where we get into some serious spoilers. And that's it for me, Tony D and Little Joan. See you in Spoiler Town.